Okay, so we love it when you send in stuff that we can dig into, and this one's a doozy.
Yeah.
How to Human Part 8, Fail Faster in Lifelong Learning. I mean, who doesn't want to know how to human better?
Right. I mean, just those titles alone, those are some pretty fundamental skills we're talking about here
Absolutely.
for how to sort of navigate life and all the challenges that come with it.
Exactly.
So I'm really intrigued to see where this takes us.
Me too. So, what is this how to human thing anyway? Like, is it like a rule book or?
It's interesting, the way it's framed, it's not so much about dictating a specific set of, steps or rules to follow.
Yeah.
It's more like it's trying to give you sort of like the core abilities and the ways of seeing the world that can help you be more effective at being human.
I like that.
Yeah. And this section in particular about how we deal with mistakes and the importance of always keep learning.
Yeah.
That seems like a really central piece of the puzzle,
Yeah. That's so true. So let's talk about that fail faster and lifelong learning.
Yeah, okay.
Like right off the bat, fail faster. That sounds kind of scary. Does that mean like we should just like go out and try to mess everything up? Like, is that the point?
No, not at all. I mean, the whole point here is that you're going to make mistakes. It's inevitable.
Right.
It's part of being human, part of growing,
Yeah.
But failing faster, what they're really getting at is that we need to learn from those mistakes quickly.
Okay.
And adapt and not get bogged down by, this fear of being wrong or messing things up.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's almost like every time you stumble, it's like you're gathering data. And the faster you gather that data, the quicker you can refine your approach and to figure out what works and what doesn't.
That's a really good way to look at it. And I feel like that lifelong learning idea that goes hand in hand with that. It's that constant curiosity and that drive to always be getting better throughout our lives.
Exactly. And that's not just about, acquiring more knowledge or skills. It's also about, being able to adapt to new situations and constantly trying to improve in all these different areas of our lives, from our work to our relationships.
Totally.
And what's fascinating is how the text really links these two ideas together.
Yeah.
It's suggesting that the people who are willing to see failure as a learning opportunity, they're the ones who are going to adapt and improve much faster than the people who are afraid to even make a mistake in the first place.
So this mindset is like really important then, right?
Hugely important, yeah.
Like this whole idea that failure can actually be like this really powerful teacher. I feel like we hear that a lot, but it's so true.
It is. And if you think about it, pretty much every major achievement, every breakthrough, whether it's personal or professional, it usually comes after a whole bunch of attempts that didn't quite work out,
All those things that didn't go right.
Exactly. And the source material really emphasizes that even the most like revolutionary innovations or profound personal transformations, they all come from this willingness to experiment, to try things out, knowing that you might encounter setbacks along the way, and to really like mine those experiences for the lessons they hold.
And I feel like the opposite of that, like that fear of failure, that's almost like the opposite of this growth mindset that we're talking about. Right?
Absolutely. And that fear, it can be so limiting. It can lead to, procrastination or this kind of like analysis paralysis. Where you're so afraid of making a mistake that you don't even start.
You just don't do anything.
Or you just stick with what's comfortable and familiar, even if it's not really fulfilling.
Right.
And the text highlights how this fear of failure can actually fuel perfectionism, which might sound counterintuitive, but that striving for perfection can actually prevent you from taking action.
Because you never feel like it's good enough.
Right. Exactly. And it can even lead you to avoid new experiences altogether, which means you're, missing out on all sorts of opportunities for growth and learning.
So, like, how do we actually get better at this whole failing faster thing? Like, it's one thing to understand it in theory, but like how will we actually put it into practice?
Well, the text actually gives some really practical steps that we can take, and the first one is to actively reframe how we think about failure.
Okay.
So instead of beating yourself up and asking why did I fail, the key is to shift that question to what did this teach me? To really look at those moments not as, personal attacks or signs that you're not good enough, but as neutral pieces of information that can help you figure out what to do next.
So it's like almost taking the emotion out of it.
Exactly.
And looking at it like with a more objective lens. Like, okay, this happened. what can I learn from it? How can I move forward?
Right. And another really powerful idea that the text talks about is this concept of taking imperfect action.
Imperfect action. Okay.
So often we wait for, the perfect conditions.
Right.
Or we want to have this flawless plan before we even start.
We want to get it all figured out.
Yeah, and the problem is that can lead to inaction.
Oh, yeah, you just end up not doing anything.
Exactly. And the source material really argues that real learning happens by getting started. By taking action, even if it's not perfect, even if you're not completely sure what you're doing.
Interesting.
Because it's through that process of doing and then adjusting based on what you learn along the way that you actually make progress.
So like your first attempt is almost like a prototype. It's not about being perfect.
Exactly.
It's about learning and then iterating from there.
Yeah, exactly. It's about prioritizing that momentum and the learning that comes from taking action over trying to get everything perfect right from the start.
I love that. So it's about progress over perfection.
Yes, absolutely.
Are there other like actionable steps that the text suggests for actually like building this muscle?
Yeah, there are a few more really good ones. One is to try to set goals that are centered around learning rather than just outcomes.
Okay.
So instead of saying, like, I have to ace this presentation,
right,
you could say, I want to improve my public speaking skills through this experience.
Oh, wow. That's a really good reframing.
Yeah, because it kind of takes some of the pressure off, of the final result, and it shifts the focus to your personal development, which is something that you have more control over.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
What else? Another one is the importance of your environment.
Okay.
So both in terms of the people you surround yourself with and the resources you have access to. Try to cultivate an environment that values experimentation and learning, rather than one that demands immediate perfection.
Right. So you want to be around people who are also embracing this mindset.
Exactly. Yeah. And a really important one that I think often gets overlooked is regular reflection.
Oh.
Taking the time to, maybe journal about your mistakes, or to consciously think about the lessons you've learned really helps you to internalize those insights and avoid just repeating the same errors over and over again.
So it's not enough to just like make the mistake and then move on.
Right.
You have to actually take the time to really think about it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about actively extracting the valuable information that's embedded within that mistake.
That's so interesting. Yeah, the source also talks about this idea of feedback loops. And it seems like that's a more kind of structured approach to using failure for growth.
Yeah, it is. And the way the source material defines a feedback loop is as a system where you take action.
Okay.
You see what happens, you analyze those results, and then based on that analysis, you make adjustments for next time.
So it's a constant cycle.
It is, yeah. It's a continuous cycle of action analysis and adjustment.
And that helps ensure that failure actually becomes a catalyst for growth.
Exactly. Instead of, just being a source of discouragement.
Right, or just like giving up. So what makes these feedback loops so important in this whole process of failing faster and learning more effectively?
Well, without that structured analysis, we can easily fall into the trap of repeating the same mistakes without ever really understanding why we're making them.
Right.
Or we might get discouraged, and abandon a goal prematurely.
Just because we're not seeing results right away.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't see that immediate progress and we think, oh, this isn't working.
Right.
But feedback loops give you that framework for turning those missteps into actual learning opportunities.
And the source highlights two main types of feedback, right?
Yeah, there's internal feedback and external feedback.
Okay.
And internal feedback is what we were just talking about.
Right, that self-reflection.
Yeah, it's that self-reflection, taking the time to review your own actions, to analyze your past decisions, to track your progress. How are you doing against your goals?
Right. Are you actually moving forward?
Exactly. And then external feedback is the input that comes from outside of yourself.
Okay.
So that could be feedback from, mentors or colleagues, or even just looking at measurable outcomes.
Like the results of your efforts.
Exactly. And that can give you perspectives that you might not be able to see on your own.
So it's like getting a more complete picture of how you're doing, both from your own point of view,
right,
from the point of view of like the world around you.
Exactly.
So how do we actually put these feedback loops into practice in our daily lives?
Well, the source material presents this really simple but powerful cycle.
Okay.
Act, Analyze, adjust, repeat.
Okay, I like that.
So after you take an action, whatever it is you're working on,
yeah,
you consciously stop and ask yourself, what went well?
Okay.
What didn't go so well?
Yeah.
And what could I do differently next time?
I like that.
And a really important point that the text makes is to try to get feedback early and often.
Okay.
Rather than waiting until the very end of a project or whatever endeavor you're working on.
It's interesting.
Because the sooner you get that input,
yeah,
the quicker you can make those course corrections.
Right. You don't have to wait until the end to realize that you need to change something.
Exactly. And another crucial element here is to really try to separate your emotions from your evaluation of the feedback. So it's easy to, get defensive or take things personally.
If someone's criticizing your work.
Exactly. But the key is to remember that feedback isn't a judgment of your inherent worth.
Okay.
It's just data about the effectiveness of your approach.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity to refine what you're doing to make it better.
So it's like you're constantly experimenting and improving based on the feedback that you're getting.
Exactly. And that ties into what the text calls an iterative mindset.
Iterative mindset.
Which is this understanding that improvement is a continuous process.
Yeah.
And each attempt you make is a chance to get a little bit better, rather than expecting to be perfect right out of the gate.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's kind of like in the tech world how they do beta testing.
Right.
They release a product that's not perfect.
Yeah.
They get feedback from users, and then they use that feedback to continuously update and improve the product.
So we can kind of apply that same approach to our own lives.
Exactly. That's exactly what the source material suggests.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And whether it's, improving your public speaking skills or your writing or developing your leadership abilities or even working towards fitness goals.
Right.
These small cycles of action, feedback, and refinement can be incredibly powerful.
So it's like small steps over time lead to big results.
Exactly.
Now imagine all this is easier said than done. Like actually putting this into practice. What are some of the challenges that people might face?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is the fear of judgment.
Yeah.
That anxiety about what other people will think if we make a mistake.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And the text suggests that we try to shift our focus away from seeking external validation and more towards our own internal growth.
So like instead of worrying about what other people think, you're more focused on your own progress.
Exactly. Ask yourself, am I learning? Am I improving? Am I challenging myself?
Right. Those are good questions.
And if the answer is yes, then you're on the right track, regardless of what anyone else thinks.
So it's about like taking back control of your own growth.
Exactly.
What about other challenges?
Another really common one is perfectionism.
Oh, yeah.
That feeling that everything has to be perfect before you can even start.
Right. And that can be so paralyzing.
It can, yeah. And the solution that the text offers is to actually embrace small failures early on.
Okay.
Particularly in low-stakes situations.
What kind of situations?
Well, like learning a new language, for example.
Okay.
Where making mistakes is part of the process.
Right.
It's inevitable you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And by doing that, by allowing yourself to make those small mistakes, you kind of normalize failure. And you start to see it as just a natural part of learning.
Yeah.
Rather than this catastrophic event to be avoided at all costs.
That's like building up a tolerance for the messy part of learning.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, that's a good one. What else? What other challenges are there?
Another one that the text addresses is the issue of repeatedly making the same mistakes.
Oh, right. So it's not enough to just fail.
Right.
You have to actually learn from it.
Exactly. Yeah. And failing faster is only really beneficial if we're actually extracting those lessons from our failures. So if you find yourself kind of stuck in a loop, making the same errors over and over again, that's a sign that you need to pause.
Okay.
You need to analyze what's going wrong. And maybe seek some external feedback.
Yeah.
To get a fresh perspective on what needs to change.
Okay, I like that. Yeah. I feel like this source does a really good job of bringing these ideas to life with some really compelling real-world examples.
Absolutely. Yeah, the historical examples are fantastic.
Like, what are some of the ones that stood out to you?
Well, they talk about Thomas Edison.
Right.
And all of his countless attempts to create the light bulb.
He's famous for that.
He is. And then there's J.K. Rowling, who faced numerous rejections.
For Harry Potter.
For Harry Potter, yeah. Before she finally found a publisher.
That's amazing.
And these stories, they illustrate so powerfully that success isn't really about avoiding failure. It's about persistence.
Yeah.
And learning from those setbacks, And the text emphasizes that their ultimate breakthroughs came about because they treated each failure not as a dead end, but as a piece of information that guided their next step.
So they were able to kind of course correct based on the failures that they experienced.
Exactly.
I love that. And it's not just, these big historical figures, right?
Yeah.
Like the source also talks about more like everyday examples that we could all relate to.
Absolutely. Yeah. They talk about things like learning to ride a bike. Or playing a musical instrument. Or even mastering a new recipe in the kitchen.
Right.
And these are all things where, we kind of inherently expect to be a little bit clumsy or awkward at first.
Right.
And to make mistakes along the way.
Yeah, it's part of the process.
It is. And it's through that process of trial and error, of learning from those initial missteps that we eventually get better.
So it's like this universal principle that applies to so many different areas of our lives.
Yeah, exactly. And the source makes that connection really explicitly.
Yeah.
They talk about how this fundamental way of learning applies to broader personal growth, to career advancement, and even to the development of our relationships.
Wow. So this whole concept of fail faster, learn faster.
Yeah.
It's actually like, it's kind of empowering when you think about it that way.
It is.
Because it takes away some of that fear and negativity that we often associate with making mistakes.
Right.
And it reframes those mistakes as actually being essential for growth.
Exactly. And it gives us permission to not be perfect.
Right.
To experiment, to try new things, knowing that we're going to learn something along the way.
Yeah, even if we don't succeed right away.
Right. And the source actually concludes this section with some really thought-provoking reflection questions.
Okay, what are some?
Well, they ask things like, do you find yourself avoiding new experiences because you're afraid of failing?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and think about the last time you encountered a significant setback. What specific lessons did you learn from that experience?
Wow.
And when you face obstacles, do you typically react by reflecting and adjusting, or do you tend to get discouraged and give up? That's a good question to ask yourself.
Yeah, and these questions, they're really designed to help us kind of take a step back.
Right.
And look at our own relationship with failure.
Yeah.
And to see where we might be getting in our own way.
To challenge our assumptions.
Exactly.
What about other questions? What else do they ask?
They also have some questions that are aimed at kind of shifting our underlying beliefs about failure.
Okay.
So they ask things like, do you generally view failure as a definitive endpoint? Or do you see it as an integral part of the learning process?
Oh, that's deep.
Yeah. And then they even have like a call to action.
They ask, what is one small risk that you could take today that could potentially lead to meaningful growth regardless of the outcome?
I like that.
And all of these questions are really designed to help us move beyond just understanding these ideas intellectually.
Right.
And to actually start to embody them in our lives.
To put them into practice.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the final takeaway from this section is really powerful.
Yeah.
They say, the faster you fail, the faster you learn.
Yeah.
The faster you learn, the faster you grow.
It's so simple.
It is.
Yeah. But it's so true.
And it's kind of encouraging in a way.
Yeah, it is. It's like it's giving us permission to make mistakes.
Right.
And to learn from them and to not let that fear of failure hold us back.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into part 8 of How to Human, this section on fail faster and the lifelong learning, it's clear that it's not just about like, grudgingly accepting that mistakes are going to happen. It's about actually like seeking out the learning potential in those mistakes.
Absolutely.
And using them to fuel our growth.
Yeah, it's about being proactive about our own development.
Exactly.
And not being afraid to step outside of our comfort zones.
So for you, the listener, what's one small step that you can take today? One tiny risk that you can embrace that might open up a new avenue for learning, even if it means that you might stumble along the way.
And this raises a really interesting question, doesn't it?
What's that?
Like maybe the true measure of success isn't the absence of failure, but the speed and intentionality with which we learn and recover from it.
I love that.
what possibilities might open up for you if you actively sought out opportunities for learning and growth, even if they involved a certain degree of risk?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with.
I think so.
So much to think about.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
This is a good one.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.